Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Collateral Optimization Strategies under the new IOSCO Margin Regulations, hosted by Asia Risk in association with Calypso Technology. My name is Aaron Walnut and I'm the editor of Asia Risk. In the initial stages of the post-GFC reform of the OTC markets, regulators focused on moving derivatives onto central clearinghouses and setting up the related regulatory and electronic trading frameworks. All the major IRS markets in the US, Europe, Japan and Australia are a relatively advanced stage in this process. Attention subsequently switched to the slightly thornier question of how to deal with instruments which are not easily cleared and as such would remain bilaterally focused markets. In 2013, BCBS IOSCO published its original proposals, which were reviewed on March 18 this year, which delayed the implementation of both initial and variation margin by 9 months and introduced a phase and arrangement for variation margin. The lack of global margin calculation standards, however, means that despite this delay, derivative users are still in the dark over the exact impact of the move to margining non-cleared derivatives will have on the use of collateral in their businesses and the possible knock-on effect on pricing. So I'm fortunate to have a very experienced panel with me today to shed some light on the exact nature of these proposals and how best to deal with them. On the banking side, I have with me here in Hong Kong, Odell Burke, who's head of product for APAC Collateral Management at JP Morgan. And next is a fellow Hong Kong resident, Karim Shaban, who's also head of product for APAC Collateral Management, but this time at Citi. Dialing in from Australia is John Feeney, who's head of pricing for National Australia Bank. While based in London and giving us the tech solution provider angle on this issue is David Little, Director of Strategy and Business Development for Calypso Technologies. Our final panelist is Nick Horn, Manager in the Compliance and Risk Management Department at QIC in Brisbane. We've got a lot to get through in the next 60 minutes, but before we start, I just want to explain a little bit about the format. Intervals throughout the conversation, we will conduct polling questions from you, the audience. I'll explain how those work at the time, but the real key point I'd like to make is the panelists are very keen to hear on your views. You can get direct questions from the audience. If at any point you have a question for all or one of the panelists, please click the Ask Question button on the attendee panel part of the dial-in function and send a message the question across, and we will try and get those to the panelists and get a response. The webinar will also be recorded and will be available online permanently from within, I think, a couple of hours of the webinar itself finishing. So without further ado, I'd like to start today's discussion. I'd like to start with Odell. Just before we go into some of the details over some of the implications, perhaps you could give us a background about what's happened, what's the background to these proposals and what the change has been made, and perhaps give us some context to the following discussion.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Aaron. So in terms of just setting the context as far as this particular change, with respect to non-centrally cleared derivative and the requirement that those trading arrangements should have a proper sort of margin process around that. The impetus of this started off, of course, the 2009 G20 commitment. This was the fourth element in terms of, the three commitments that come before. The first was to do with the standardization of OTC derivatives such that they can clear through exchange. The second was to do with the fact that you will have CCPs that would be responsible for clearing these type of standardized OTC derivative. The third element was to do with more from a reporting perspective where we would have trade repository. So now we're on the fourth element, which has to do with the margin arrangement for the non-centrally cleared derivatives. I guess in terms of change as far as managing this arrangement, I think the first major change in terms of what has been traditionally the practice in the market and the direction that we're going now is around the departure from this being a discretionary activity. In the past, the posting of margin and the margin that was posted at that time for OTC derivative was just basically variation margin. With what we're looking at in terms of moving forward, not only you will have a variation margin, but you have the introduction of initial margin. So this is a departure in terms of what was the traditional practice in terms of your traditional buy-side or sell-side clients trading these products. The other major change just in the derivatives space is the bifurcation of the portfolio, if you will. So before, you basically had, the ubiquitous OTC derivative portfolio would, of course, differ by the different types of contracts that might be in a given portfolio. Now that portfolio is split between cleared versus non-cleared. So in terms of from a liquidity perspective, when you look at it from a collateral perspective, you have to now think holistically across those two trade buckets, in addition to other trading activities that you would have, like, for example, repo trading or stock loan or securities lending trading. As long as you have other type of secure type of activities taking place, you need to think how you're going to utilize your inventory pool as far as collateral across all these trading arrangements. So those are some examples of areas that have impacted the traditional way in terms of OTC derivatives, and the fact that now we have the introduction of margin requirements for the non-cleared derivatives.
Okay, thank you, Hotel. So just kind of bringing on, there's been some quite practical implications. I think, yet again, we come back to the Asia-Pacific market has some slightly different dynamics to Europe and North America, which is driving a lot of the regulatory agenda. And I'd like to bring sort of John Feeney in at this point. I mean, a particular issue, I think, for the Asian market has been that the cross-currency swap is a very major component of Asian derivative markets, yet it's quite complex to clear. This has been a particular problem for the Australian market. And I was just wondering, John, if you could perhaps sort of talk through the CCS issue and whether it's kind of been resolved.
Yeah, the important thing I think with CCS is that it's highly unlikely that they're going to be cleared anytime soon, and probably an issue that is common to Australian banks as well as New Zealand and Canadian banks is the sheer amount of cross-currency swap that we have, which supports the bank's issuance into mainly the US market. So we actually have a significant amount of cross-currency swap which won't be cleared in a hurry. That has dominated much of our thought when it comes down to how we would handle an uncleared position and what we might do with initial margin and how we might handle that variation margin-wise. Variation margin's been used on these for many years, so we're reasonably familiar with that. Introduction of initial margin is going to be a much more problematic issue for two reasons. One is that foreign exchange is exempt, and a cross-currency swap is a bit of a mix between a foreign exchange contract and two interest rate contracts. So if you're not careful, you can actually allow a sort of form of regulatory or capital arbitrage if you split up the cross-currency swap into an FX trade, which has one capital and initial margin approach, specifically no initial margin, and one which would actually be incorporated into the new regulation. So we don't want that to happen. So one of the major challenges we have is to make sure that we get an appropriate treatment for cross-currency swaps, both in collateral and initial margin, to ensure that we don't open up this sort of crazy situation where we would have particular swaps that if they're booked in a particular way, actually have a very, very different approach to initial margin of capital. Just I wanted to pick up on one point that Odell made on the initial margin, which I think was maybe a very, very good introduction. Initial margin, as I just said, particularly for things like cross-currency swaps, having an agreed and standardised calculation is one of the major challenges, because it would seem rather inappropriate if two counterparties calculated an initial margin for the swaps they had between themselves, and you came up with two very, very different numbers. So in other words, two different people posting two different initial margin numbers to each other. And then very, very quickly, you've got to figure out who's going to hold the initial margin. And that's been one of the major problems that we've seen in the market. Calculation of the initial margin, and then secondly, who's going to hold it so that you can achieve this sort of independence or segregation of the initial margin. They're a couple of the major things that we're concentrating on at the moment.
Two excellent points there. So, David, I was wondering if I could bring you on the first of John's points about the issue over calculating initial margin. Perhaps why is it that why isn't a global standard emerged so far with respect to calculating initial margin?
So I think there's several reasons for that. The The original BCBS IOSCO paper gave two methodologies for the calculation of the initial margin. The first was a simple table looking up the notional value with different multiples depending on the product type. So that would be easy to calculate, easy to verify your counterpart's number. But the percentages of notionals that were used were rather high and would lead to very high initial margin amounts. The alternative is a risk-based model, similar to the VAR models that CCPs use for OTC derivatives, but with deliberately a 10-day period of risk, and in order to make the initial margin on non-cleared derivatives at least as high and probably higher than it would be for clearing. So that was deliberate by the regulators to create an incentive to clear, so that there'd be no incentive to keep things on the uncleared side. They also required, in the original documentation, each firm to obtain